This is the next lesson in Unit 1, American West. And this one is going to focus a lot more on the Oregon Trail and look at two different groups. One of them really didn't travel it very well. Another one travelled it really well, and we need to look at the difference between the two. So what this lesson is going to look at today is looking at the problems of travelling on the Oregon Trail. Looking at the advice you would give someone who was travelling on the Oregon Trail to be successful. And then lastly, we're going to look at the story of the Donner Party and assess the problems and mistakes that they made on their journey. So back to the NXL specification, we are on point 2 here, migration and early settlement. And we're looking at the process and problems of migration, including the experience of the Donner Party. The Mormons will be separate, but the Donner Party is one we need to look at separately because of the failures that they went through. So first little revision task. So I'm going to go through a range of information. We need to consider the problems of the Oregon Trail and how to be successful. So in one colour, you could write down the problems of the Oregon Trail, and the other, you could write how to be successful. So here we've got a picture of a map. Now, one thing we've got to understand is that the Oregon Trail wasn't the only way to get from A to B. In some places, you use different trails to get to different parts. So if you have a look here, we've got the Oregon Trail here. Then we've got the California Trail, the sort of light green. We've got the Mormon Trail. We've got the Old Spanish Trail. We've got the Santa Fe Trail and the Gila River Trail. You've got loads of different routes. Now, if you have a look here, there's different. So, for example, if you start in Independence, Missouri, you have to take the Santa Fe Trail. Going back, you have to take the Santa Fe Trail to get to Santa Fe. If you want to get to San Diego, you then have to take the Gila River Trail. All of these trails have significant challenges that migrants have to cross. So if we have a look at each one, remember, as you're going through this, make notes about the problems that migrants face travelling from east to west. So the first one, migrants crossed a fertile plain of tall prairie grass to the Platte River. Tall prairie grass, I mean, it all depends when it is. If it's very hot, prairie grass can catch on fire. The second thing they do, they follow the wide, muddy Platte River into Nebraska, where the grass was shorter. Now think, crossing a river might be difficult, especially if they've got their wagons. They would need access, they'd need routes to get across. Point 3, so after they've done point 2, crossing the Platte River, point 3, they faced on the Great Plains sandstorms, quicksand, rain, hunger, stampeding buffalo, sometimes angry, hostile Indians. They stopped at Fort Kearny and then at Fort Laramie to rest people and animals and take on supplies. Faced extreme heat by day and thunderstorms by night. Now, what you've got to consider here is that while doing this, people might get sick, people might slow you down, your animals might get ill, people might get disease such as cholera. And on top of that, you've got to face sandstorms, rain, hunger, buffalo stampedes, possible hostile Indians. It was a really difficult journey that people had to contemplate. And the land wasn't always flat. That's really important to understand. The land was so different in different parts of America. Some was flat, some were very sandy and dusty, some were very mountainous. So if you look at point 4, it says they climbed into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains through Indian territory, where sometimes friendly Sioux would trade and act as guides. So quite important to understand that Native Americans actually sometimes helped. They weren't these savage individuals that the white settlers painted this picture of. On some occasions, quite regular occasions, the Native Americans, the Sioux especially, would help. Water holes across the Great Plains were very salty. So the water stored on board at Fort Laramie had to be used for the people and the animals. So you had to take on enough and be able to share it out quite fairly to make sure your animals were strong enough to pull the wagons, but also the people that they were taking would survive. Point 5, they climbed even higher mountains to get through the South Pass. Dried and stored meat here because there would be no more buffalo. So once you get past the South Pass, there'd be no more buffalo. You'd need dry meat. They descended across arid wastes to Fort Bridger. Point 6, migrants split up into two groups at Fort Hall, depending on whether they were aiming for Oregon or California. So if you see here, if you were heading Fort Hall here, you'd split off. If you wanted to go to Oregon, you'd continue on the Oregon Trail. If you wanted to go to California, then you'd have to take part of the Mormon Trail and then get onto the California Trail. And this is where they took more supplies on board, and they were about halfway along the trail. When you get here, you're only about halfway. They hauled their wagons using chains, ropes, and pulleys over the Blue Mountains. Richer migrants paid Indians to ferry them and their wagons across the Dalles River. The poor abandoned their wagons and crossed as foot passengers. They walked the rest of the trail into Oregon. So if you're rich, you'd pay an Indian to do it for you. If you're poor, you'd have to walk the rest of the way, and it could lead to pretty difficult circumstances. And then point 8 there, they crossed 80 kilometers of desert to the Sierra Nevada, where they used chains, ropes, and pulleys to haul their wagons up and over the mountains and then down into the fertile Sacramento Valley. So point 7 there is if you're going to Oregon, point 8 is if you're heading into California. All of these are threats that people faced going along the Oregon Trail. The problems and the processes. So first of all, the Oregon Trail was 3,200 kilometers long. It started in the Missouri, near the Missouri River, and ended in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. You had to start before winter. The chance of freezing to death or being caught in a horrific weather could kill you. You had to leave at the right time. This was absolutely vital to being successful on the Oregon Trail. You had to begin early enough so you have plenty of resources. Now, it's not just the physical resources that you would have to take. It's also ensuring that there would be enough grass, vegetation, for your animals to have on the way there. If there wasn't enough, your animals could get weak, your oxen could die, and that would be awful, especially if you were taking a large number of migrants. Food. You need enough for the whole journey, assuming things go well. It's very much luck of the draw at times, but you've got to make sure you've got enough food to keep you going. I would say for at least a year. You need strong animals. To pull your wagons, you're going to be using an oxen. Very, very strong animals, but very slow, traveling at about 3 kilometers an hour. Again, this is why it's vital to leave on time, because if your oxen was slow, if your oxen slowed you down, then it could become very problematic and you could get caught in some life-threatening weather. Large groups, that was also a way to be more successful. Wagon trains of 20 or more. Why? There's power in numbers. The more people you had, the more supplies. On top of this, though, you needed skilled people. If you were a large group with wagon trains of 20 plus, and you didn't have people on board who were medics, if you didn't have people on board who could possibly fix wagons, then you could be in a bit of bother if someone got sick, for example, on the journey. You needed people to be able to look after you for the whole way. Water sources were also a huge problem. Because there were so many people traveling the Oregon Trail, everyone used the same water. They washed in it, they urinated in it. Cholera was one of the biggest killers on this Oregon Trail. And there was a significant fear of attack by the Native Americans, but as mentioned in the previous slide, this wasn't really a massive problem. This was something that was maybe fabricated by previous white settlers who wanted to scaremonger people into thinking that Native Americans were this savage group of individuals. Some were very violent, others were there to help you. So I'm going to show you a list of statements. Now, based on what I've just gone through, you need to just have a look at it and decide what advice you would give. So these are your scenarios. Statement 1, leave in April or November. What would you advise and why? Statement 2, Complete your journey before or during the winter. Some of these might be really daft, but actually it is really important. Number 3, only take food that you can carry. Take fresh food. 4, take horses to pull the carts. 5, travel in large groups of about 20 wagons or more. Make sure you have lots of skilled people. And last one, look for shortcuts or stick to the normal journey which has been mapped out. For each of those, just pause this video shortly. I'm not going to go through the answers because it actually has the answers in what I've just gone through. This is a good little revision task for you to understand the main ways to be successful on the Oregon Trail. So just pause the video now, and then once it's done, we'll move on to the first group, the Donner Party. Now, the story of the Donner Party is a very short one. It's not a very nice one, but it's a very short one. And the Donner Party, I'm gonna say some things that are away from the text on the screen. I'm going to go through 2 things, but first of all, I'm just going to give you a bit of information that I know personally. So Donner Party, they were about a group of around 300 migrants who had about 60 wagons. They were led by the Donner brothers, and they started in May 1846. That is not a bad time to start. Probably about a few weeks too late, but it's not a bad time to start. They had a lot more elderly people, women and children than usual groups have, so that might be a bit of a problem later. Now, in a minute, you're going to make a list of what mistakes the Donner Party made. So just listen carefully to these bits, because these bits are not on the screen. They set off around May time, and in July they reached Fort Bridger in the Rocky Mountains. Now, just go back to this map. Okay, so Fort Bridger is here, and they reached there in July 1846. But when they got to Fort Bridger, a mistake was made. What they decided at Fort Bridger was to split up. 80 of the 300 migrants, including the Donner brothers, tried a shortcut that they thought would cut about 550 kilometers off their journey. They actually went down the route of a trailblazer known as Lanford Hastings, who had written a guide, a shortcut. The shortcut they were going down was described as fine, it was very fertile, there was lots of drinking water. The problem was, the person that wrote it, Lanford Hastings, never actually tried the route himself. He only wrote it because he thought it would work, not because he knew it would work. The only problem with this shortcut was it actually added hundreds of miles onto their journey. It added about 100 plus miles to their journey when they thought it was going to cut around 400 miles off. Now, the problem also is that on this journey, there weren't any water sources marked out, there weren't any river stoppings marked out. Unlike the Oregon Trail, where everything was mapped out in quite an organised manner, the Hastings Trail didn't have the same luxuries. So what you've got to understand is actually getting through the Lanford Hastings Trail was actually very difficult. It didn't have routes marked out. There was also stretches of the Hastings Trail where there was no water, so animals were going to get sick. I'm just going to go through this information on the screen. This summarises the Donner Party very, very briefly. So the journey westwards was highly dangerous. The story of the Donner Party highlights the plight and severeness of such a journey. Now, 80 people. That was how many people became the shortcut. As I mentioned, there was around 300, and they followed the Hastings Trail. 31st of July, which was late in the season by the time they took their shortcut, then they made the tragic decision to take the Hastings Cutoff, a shortcut which they were told would save them 400 miles. It didn't, it added hundreds of miles to it. The route was difficult. They had to abandon all their cattle while crossing the Salt Lake Desert. They were attacked by Paiute warriors. Fights broke out. one of the Donner Party was killed by a hostile Native American. On the 30th of October, the party reached the last mountain pass before California. Now, it doesn't say this here, but while they were traveling, an axle broke on their wagon. And while they were trying to fix it, snow fell overnight. So they had to stay there because their axle was broken. Now there were 5 feet of snowdrift. They were stranded there for the rest of the winter. That's hugely problematic. Within 3 weeks, their food ran out. They ate sticks, bones, mud, and eventually each other. So it says here, after a journey of 2,500 miles, they were 150 miles away from Sutter's Fort, which is where they were aiming for. But after 2,500 miles of journey, they were stuck. For 4 months, they ate their cattle, the bark, twigs, each other. The first person they ate was on Christmas Day, of that year, which is pretty traumatic when you think about it. Rescue groups from Fort Sutter managed to rescue the others, the last one in April 1847. And out of the 80 plus who set out, 46 survived and just over 40 died. And those numbers, again, they're different in what you read. The one story that does stand out is that George Donner, one of the brothers that took the shortcut, he was found dead. His skull was shattered open and his brains were missing. So, I mean, you can infer all you want there, but it suggests that his brains may have been eaten for survival of others. So, what mistakes did the Donner Party make? This is your job to make a list. So you could look at timing in which they left. May. You can look at taking the fact they took more more women, children, and elderly than usual. Because of that, you could say there might have been a lack of skilled individuals on this route. The biggest mistake, the Hastings shortcut. Thought it would cut 400 miles. It actually added 100. Another mistake, the shortcut took them in mountains which their wagon could not cope with, leading to a broken axle. Well, that broken axle led to them being stranded in the mountains over the winter. Food supplies could be another problem. The fact that they did not have enough to split between 2 groups. There's a range of things you can consider. What we do know is that the Donner Party did not do it right. And actually, I'm going to add one thing here. Power in numbers. Only 80 people took the Hastings Trail. Is this enough? That's something you've got to consider as well. So the Donner Party made a range of mistakes. And the sad thing is, after 2,500 miles, we're only 150 miles away. Those people that took the shortcut did not survive. A lot of them did not survive. The people that didn't take the shortcut made it to their destination well. So what you do need to know for the Donner Party is just why they failed and also the order in which they did their journey. So it's quite nice to have a timeline of the Donner Party, especially if you get one of those narrative account questions. That would be very useful to understand what they did, what it led to, what happened next, what it led to, and what happened lastly, and what it led to, the overall outcome of the story. But the key thing is the Donner Party did the Oregon Trail very, very wrong, and it led to cannibalism, a lot of death, and it also led to them being remembered as the party that did it all wrong and ended up, unfortunately perishing because of the severity of the Oregon Trail.